How do we know what we know about the 2020 election? How do we know what we know about the coronavirus vaccine? How do we know what we know? You're opening the Infinite Lunchbox. I'm Stephanie Lepp, and today we're going to talk about how in the world we make sense of the world. And we're going to explore the possibility of a next enlightenment. First, we're going to quickly establish where we're at with the post-truth crisis. And then we're going to dive into how to transcend the post-truth crisis and move into this next enlightenment. Here we go. So we are in a post-truth crisis. We've entered an era in which public opinion is increasingly shaped less by fact and more by personal belief. We've lost trust in legacy media and academic science and other institutions that historically delivered us the truth. And are things getting dark? Yes. But is the answer to double down on capital T truth and scale up on deepfake detectors? No. Or at least not only. Because even if we magically eliminated all deepfakes, we would still be in a post-truth crisis. We would still be in a crisis of epistemological proportions. And a crisis of epistemological proportions requires nothing short of an epistemological solution. Which is why our post-truth crisis is also an opportunity, aka a crisitunity, for evolving our epistemology, for evolving how we know what we know, and for evolving our relationship with truth. I'd go as far as to say that our post-truth crisis is a crisitunity for shifting into a new enlightenment. Our first enlightenment was a shift from superstition and myth and magic to science and reason and rationality. And so our next enlightenment has to be an integration. Our next enlightenment has to hold on to science and reason and rationality and capital T truth, and also make room for partial truth and uncertainty and other ways of knowing, and under the right circumstances, yes, even superstition and myth and magic. But how do we make that leap? What would it even mean to evolve our relationship with truth and shift into our next enlightenment? Let's dive in. First, evolving our relationship with truth means acknowledging when the situation isn't black and white, but a little more gray. It means that instead of saying that vaccines are always 100% safe, acknowledging that vaccines present risks, but that their public health benefits far outweigh those risks. It means that instead of saying that QAnon is entirely 1,000,000% false, acknowledging that there are absolutely dark forces with way too much power over the world, but they are not a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles. Quoting the imaginary Alex Jones from Deep Reckonings,
"There is a child sex abuse problem on our hands, folks, but it's not Hillary Clinton and the deep state. It's the Catholic Church."
Because when authorities pretend that things are black and white, people can smell the gray, and they lose trust in the authorities, and they run to conspiracy theories. And when the authorities refuse to acknowledge the kernels of partial truth in those conspiracies, people run to them even harder. And so evolving our relationship with truth means not spoon-feeding ourselves black and white. It means giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt that we can handle the gray. It means helping us handle the gray on everything from vaccines to state power. Evolving our relationship with truth also means democratizing the production of truth. Don't worry, scientists and journalists, I am not saying crowdsource everything. I'm saying take a cue from post-normal science. Stay with me, y'all. Post-normal science is a framework for building public consensus around science. And it goes like this. In circumstances of low stakes or uncertainty, we're all good with applied science, which involves smaller numbers of scientists practicing what we consider to be normal peer-reviewed science. Circumstances of medium stakes or uncertainty call for professional consultancy, which also involves non-scientist experts like doctors and engineers. But in circumstances of high stakes or high uncertainty, we need post-normal science, which engages the broader public in collecting data or constructing hypotheses or otherwise participating in the production of scientific knowledge. The basic point that post-normal science is making is that as uncertainty or stakes get high, science must become more democratic. Because when uncertainty or stakes are high, the public needs to be involved in the process of producing the science in order to trust the results. And I do believe, for example, that if climate scientists had spent less time doing applied science in Antarctica and more time doing post-normal science with small farmers and flood victims and even gardeners, I think we would have a much broader public consensus that climate change is a veritable crisis. And so, evolving our relationship with truth means that under circumstances of high stakes or uncertainty, more people participate in the production of truth and knowledge. And for more fun with post-normal science, watch the Infinite Lunchbox episode, How to Agree on Science. Evolving our relationship with truth and shifting into our next enlightenment also means making room for other ways of knowing. Let's get into this one with a story. Once upon a time, I was taking a soil science class in grad school, and I did a research paper on the phenomenon of geophagy, which is the practice of eating soil. So throughout history, Native Americans ate soil. They mixed soil into their acorn meal in order to detoxify the tannins in the acorns and to get minerals and nutrients from the soil. And we actually eat soil too, but we don't think about it that way because it's dressed up in pills that we call vitamins. Anyway, Native Americans practiced geophagy. But what I found about geophagy in the scientific literature was essentially, wow, can you believe that Native Americans were doing something that made sense? I mean, we proved that eating soil makes sense. We proved that geophagy makes sense. But did we really prove that geophagy makes sense? No. Geophagy had already made sense to the people practicing it for hundreds and thousands of years. All we proved was that we were able to understand geophagy through our own scientific materialist way of knowing. And so I ended up writing my research paper about the arrogance of Western science in its treatment of geophagy, which my soil science professor did not whatsoever appreciate. But the point is, there are different ways of knowing. In this case, different ways of knowing that it might be beneficial to consume soil. And so moving into our next enlightenment means making room for more different ways of knowing. It means acknowledging what I call the fractalicious nature of isness, the fact that what is manifests itself at multiple levels of organization. So we don't necessarily need to know soil science in order to take the action of consuming soil. This is going to get me into trouble, but we may not even need to, or at least all need to, know climate science in order to take climate action. Because climate change manifests itself not just in our climate, but thanks to the fractalicious nature of isness, it also manifests itself in our lungs and our gardens and floods and fires and wars and at other levels of organization that we can readily perceive and act on. And if that's too out there for you, you might at least agree that some things may not need scientific proof in order for us to act on them. Because what's going to happen when we need experts to tell us to drink clean water and that affection is important? Oh shit, we're already there. So the next enlightenment means making room for other, perhaps lower maintenance, ways of knowing that can also lead to rightful action. Because after all, what is the purpose of knowing? Why do we want to know what's true? Yes, of course, there is knowledge for its own sake. And also, we want to know what's true in order to do things, in order to deal with climate change and coronavirus and the other challenges of our time. And different ways of knowing can get us to the same rightful action. And finally, a new enlightenment means holding truth not as the one and only value. Another story. In the Deep Reckoning's deepfake video of Alex Jones, he's having an imaginary reckoning with his spread of deceitful conspiracy theories in dialogue with Joe Rogan. And the way that the deepfake ends is that Alex Jones says, "So what do I do with this video?" And Joe Rogan says, "Well, what do you mean?" And Alex Jones says, "Well, it's fake, but it's true." And Joe Rogan says, "Well, why don't you just pretend this video is real?" And Alex Jones says, "Well, that's crazy." And Joe Rogan starts laughing because how hilarious is it that Alex Jones thinks it's crazy to pretend that something is fake is real? And then Joe Rogan says, "Well, why don't you come on my show and we'll do the real version?" But what if Alex Jones pretending that his Deep Reckoning's deepfake video was real is what helped him stop broadcasting lies? Would we be prepared to sacrifice all of the value that would come along with Alex Jones no longer broadcasting lies and perhaps bringing his audience, or at least some of his audience, along with him because it involved telling a lie? Or what if Alex Jones refused to say whether his Deep Reckonings video was real or fake? What if he just refused to acknowledge that, more similar to a placebo effect? Would we be, again, willing to sacrifice the social value, the progress that would come along with the transformation of Alex Jones because it involved not saying whether something was true or not? I don't know. But I'm at least willing to entertain that question. I'm at least willing to acknowledge that truth exists in tension with other values. In this case, with the value that would come with, a transformation of Alex Jones. I'm at least willing to acknowledge that truth is not the one and only value. And that truth is not just an end in itself, but also a means to an end. And sometimes the more effective means to that end might not be truth, but what we might call purposeful fiction. Here's a simpler example of purposeful fiction. My husband works in addiction medicine, and you can imagine working with someone who struggles with addiction to script a deep fake of their sober self in the future, talking to themselves now, encouraging themselves onto the path of recovery, which would be using a not real version of themselves, right? A purposeful fiction, let's say, an imaginary future version of their clean self in order to help them recover from addiction. Which leads to this wild situation where responsible deepfakes could actually help us transcend the post-truth crisis. Because if we're able to use deepfakes in a responsible way, let's say to help someone recover from addiction, we will have acknowledged that truth is not the one and only value. We will have acknowledged that sometimes a purposeful fiction might be the way to achieve our goal. We will have created a more rightful place for truth. And perhaps ironically, by putting truth in its rightful place, truth actually becomes more resilient, and we become better able to transcend the post-truth crisis. So that, my friends, is what it looks like to evolve our relationship with truth, and more broadly, to evolve how we know what we know. It looks like acknowledging partial truth and gray and uncertainty, and democratizing the production of truth and knowledge, and making room for other ways of knowing, and treating truth not just as an end in itself, but also a means to an end. And sometimes the better means to that end is purposeful fiction. Some people say that our capacity to make sense of the world is broken, and that we don't know what's next. I would say that our capacity to make sense of the world is partial, and what's next is integration. What's next is the integration of enlightenment and pre-enlightenment. What's next is maintaining the foundation of science and reason and rationality and capital T truth, and bringing back online, under the right circumstances, superstition and myth and magic, along with partial truth and uncertainty and other ways of knowing. What's next is re-enchanting the world. Because people believe in QAnon not just to make sense of the world, but to give magic and meaning and enchantment to the world. Which does not mean letting go of the Enlightenment, and does not mean letting go of truth, and absolutely does not mean there is no such thing as truth. What it means is that, on the contrary, because we care about the sanctity of truth, we need to evolve our relationship with it. It means that, yes, things are getting dark, and may we use this darkness to take the next epistemological leap. It means that, along with deepfake detectors and fact-checking and media literacy and new business models not based on maximizing user engagement and ultimately not based on maximizing profit at all cost, we also need epistemological evolution. In conclusion, they say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. It's absolutely not inevitable that we turn our post-truth crisis into an opportunity for epistemological evolution, but that is the crisis-opportunity before us. And so, a call to action. As we concern ourselves with the post-truth crisis, and as we advocate for deepfake detectors and fact-checking and media literacy and new business models, let us also advocate for epistemological evolution. Let us also advocate for evolving how in the world we make sense of the world for purposes of acting in the world. And that was the next Enlightenment, brought to you by the Infinite Lunchbox. If you enjoyed it and want more like it, please support the Infinite Lunchbox on Patreon. Thank you.